If you grew up in the 80s, or you're aware of the 80s, or you're one of those annoying kids that posts YouTube comments that you're only 12 but you love 80s music, you may have noticed a trend over the last 10 years or so. That being music, movies, and art inspired by the style and aesthetics of the 1980s. As someone who grew up in the 80s and has been obsessed with the decade ever since, I have definitely enjoyed this trend, but in this video I will try to take the nostalgia goggles off and examine this trend, the best examples of it, what caused it, and where it's heading. I'm going to focus mainly on the medium of film, and to be specific, films that embody the 80s aesthetic and story style, rather than simply using the era as a setting or subject for parody. As to why the 80s aesthetic has been so popular in this decade, I think it's a matter of cyclical fashion. In the 90s, I remember kids saying, "That is so 80s," as an insult. Now, that is probably a compliment, while "that is so 2000s" is the insult. The approximate length of the cycle seems to be around 25 years.
About 25 years?
Well, more like 20 to 30 years. It's enough time for people who grew up in the era to now be in their 30s and have the means to create art inspired by their childhood, or have a surplus of money with which to spend on music, movies, and art that takes them back to a more carefree time. These 30-somethings also tend to have kids who have been exposed to or perhaps indoctrinated into the entertainment of their parents' generation, so the themes and aesthetics of the previous generation tend to pick up traction in the youth movement as well. The 1980s are the retro obsession now, but in the 1980s it was the 1950s to the early 60s. Films like Back to the Future, Stand By Me, Diner, Dirty Dancing, and The Outsiders drew from 1950s or early 1960s nostalgia in the medium of film, while bands like the Stray Cats, the B-52s, and the Cramps drew from the sound of that era with music. Directors like Tim Burton and David Lynch also drew from the aesthetics of 1950s pop culture kitsch for films made and set in the 1980s. Grease and the series Happy Days ushered in 1950s nostalgia closer to the 20-year mark, and Dazed and Confused did the same with 70s nostalgia in the early 90s, while That 70s Show pushed the trend into the 2000s. It's not an exact science, but there seems to be a general coagulation of retro inspiration approximately a quarter century later. As for the 1980s retro revival we are currently experiencing, I first noticed this trend around 2008, but mainly in the realm of music. However, I believe the real catalyst that pushed the millennial generation in the direction of 1980s retrofuturism actually occurred back in 2002, with the release of Grand Theft Auto: Vice City. A few years earlier, the film American Psycho sparked a growing interest in the 80s era, but the film didn't really draw from the 80s in a fully stylistic sense. The era was simply the film's setting and the source of its soundtrack.
It's also a personal statement about the band itself. Hey, Paul! Ah!
With Vice City, a younger generation was not only exposed to a very cool 80s era soundtrack, but also a hyper-stylized version of 80s aesthetics. In 2007, Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez attempted a retro B-movie homage with their double effort, Grindhouse. But Tarantino's contribution, Death Proof, was more of an early 70s homage, while Rodriguez's contribution, Planet Terror, only seemed to capture the cheese of 1970s and 80s B-movies without capturing any of their redeeming qualities. And I say that as a Rodriguez fan. A year later, Nicholas Winding Refn's breakout film, Bronson, captured in moments a 1980s retro aesthetic. However, while Bronson is a stylistically groundbreaking film, the use of the retro aesthetic wasn't fully baked in my opinion. Stylistically, the film is too wild and seems to draw on the 80s aesthetic and story style only in sparse moments, or in its soundtrack. It is worth mentioning because it was the first inkling of the retrowave style that Refn would fully commit to in his later films. Perhaps the first film to effectively recreate the 80s aesthetic and story style is the 2009 throwback horror film The House of the Devil. This homage to late 70s and early 80s slasher flicks like Halloween, Suspiria, and Tenebrae recreates the aesthetics of those films in detail, right down to the shot framing, camera movement, and editing. Likewise, the story mirrors early slasher films in its simplicity and the way it slowly draws out suspense. The director, Ty West, no doubt went to great lengths to make sure this homage was as authentic as possible, in spite of the film's small budget. However, while The House of the Devil is an enjoyable 80s slasher homage, it doesn't manage to take the genres or tropes it was inspired by into new territory, unlike the next film. Panos Cosmatos' 2010 debut feature, Beyond the Black Rainbow, draws from dystopian sci-fi and horror films of the 1980s like Scanners, Videodrome, and THX 1138. Okay, granted, that last film came out in 1971, but it was ahead of its time. Beyond the Black Rainbow makes use of self-aware retro-futurist aesthetics, but pushes them further into the realm of dreamy, hypnagogic art. Despite this film's slow pace, it manages to stay engaging, weird, and very creepy, much like the earlier work of Cosmatos' fellow Canadian director, David Cronenberg. My only gripe with this film, without giving away the ending, is that the ending is a bit anticlimactic. But in my opinion, Beyond the Black Rainbow was the first retrowave film not only to recreate the 80s aesthetic, but remix it into something new and contemporary. The hyper-stylized retro aesthetics of this film likely inspired many of the retrowave projects that follow.
That's what gives me my confidence and my power.
Half a year after Beyond the Black Rainbow's release, Nicholas Winding Refn followed up what he started with Bronson, but this time went all in on the retro aesthetic. Unlike Beyond the Black Rainbow and The House of the Devil, Drive had a decent-sized budget and bankable star who helped thrust the film into mainstream recognition. Drive takes elements from 80s or close to 80s crime films like The Driver, Thief, and Manhunter, but exaggerates them, creating a hyper-real genre homage. Refn manages to walk the line of style and substance enough for us to stay engaged with and care about the characters, although at times this film does indulge a little too much in the style side of that equation. Regardless, after Drive's release, filmmakers and studios had noticed this trend and were now looking to ride the wave. J.J. Abrams took a stab at this trend later in 2011 with Super 8. But aside from using a few late 70s and 80s horror and sci-fi tropes, I don't think this film ever really captured the feel of the films it referenced. The 2012 self-aware meta-horror film, Cabin in the Woods, also made ample use of 80s horror tropes and archetypes, but was far more of a satire or critique of them than an homage, and thus I don't think it fits in the category of retrowave. Refn's next film, Only God Forgives, also used a neon-bathed retro aesthetic, but its story seems to be less of a retro homage than Drive. It is a great film, but tells its story in a more contemporary style. The next film that really went all in on the retro aesthetic, but flipped it on its head at the same time, was released in 2014. Adam Wingard's The Guest is an interesting entry in the movement of 80s retrowave cinema, because it starts out with one level of reality and slowly drags the audience into another. The initial level of reality is somewhat aligned with standard action films of the mid-2010s, but the latter reality devolves into something more attuned with genre films of the 1980s. In a way, The Guest covertly captures our attention and drags us into what turns out to be a retrowave film.
Sorry about this, Mrs. Peterson. I'm afraid I haven't been fully honest with you.
2014 also saw the release of an interesting horror flick that definitely pays homage to the kind of strange horror titles you might find in a dingy VHS rental shop. But in my opinion, It Follows dips its toes into retrowave without fully plunging in. It is a great horror film in its own right, but more of a contemporary horror film than retrowave. Perhaps the best example of purely 80s retrowave cinema in 2014 was a short film with no dialogue by musician Will Sheff. Down Down the Deep River is both an homage to 1980s kids films and I suspect a semi-autobiographical examination of childhood during the 1980s. The short film beautifully captures the era-specific pop culture obsessions, adventure, mystery, and darkness that many of us who grew up in the era are still haunted by. 2015 saw the release of two truly joyous comedic homages to 80s action and sci-fi. First with Francois Simard, Anouk and Johan Carl Wissel's Turbo Kid. 10 minutes into Turbo Kid, you can tell without a doubt that all three directors grew up in the 1980s and were fed a steady diet of 80s sci-fi cheese, cartoons, and B-movie VHS tapes. While Turbo Kid is definitely a self-aware comedy, the film also has some real heart and works well as a film in its own right, rather than simply a parody or homage to 80s films. But it is funny and a must-watch for any aging 80s kid. A considerably goofier homage to 80s action and sci-fi B-movies was released later in 2015 online. KungFury takes self-aware 80s inspired cheese to extremes, but also captures a vibrant retro aesthetic that is quite creative. I might consider it simply a great parody or satire if it weren't for the exuberance of its 80s inspired visual style. 2016 saw Nicholas Winding Refn's return to a more unabashedly retro style, with The Neon Demon. However, this examination of the dark, cannibalistic underbelly of Hollywood pays homage to 80s films mainly with its neon-bathed visual style, rather than its themes, story, or overall feel. The Void, released later that year, captured the themes and story style of 80s genre films in a far more authentic way. The Void pays homage to 80s body horror classics like John Carpenter's The Thing, Hellraiser, and The Fly, even going so far as to use animatronics and other practical effects like those in 1980s horror classics. However, The Void emulates the cheesy dialogue and at times acting of 80s B-movies a little too literally for my taste, but is still a great addition to 80s retrowave horror.
Watch the abyss open itself to me.
The most successful 80s retrowave project to date was released in the summer of 2016, although on the small screen rather than in cinemas. Stranger Things brought 80s retrowave into the mainstream, and cemented the trend as an undeniable cultural phenomenon of this decade. The series wears its influences and love for 80s horror, sci-fi, and kids films on its sleeve, but also stands on its own as a great example of those genres, making it far more than an homage. With retrowave now in the mainstream, studios have become emboldened in their ability to remake and repackage 80s properties in order to ensure a built-in audience. Perhaps the best example of this in film is the sequel to the definitive 1980s cyberpunk film Blade Runner. The original Blade Runner was far from a hit upon its release, but has become an undeniable sci-fi cult classic in the years since. Capturing lightning in a bottle twice is a nearly impossible task for any director, but Denis Villeneuve managed to do as good a job with Blade Runner 2049 as I think anyone could have. This film is far from perfect, but manages to balance being an homage to and worthy follow-up of the original, while recapturing the 1980s retro-futurist cyberpunk aesthetic.
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe.
The MCU's Thor franchise even got an 80s retrowave makeover with Thor Ragnarok. Director Taika Waititi delved a little into 80s aesthetics with his previous films Boy and Hunt for the Wilderpeople, but cranked it up for Ragnarok, which borrowed its visual style from 80s sci-fi and 70s to 80s Jack Kirby art. Although overall, this film is more of a modern action comedy than a retro homage. Finally, we arrive at Panos Cosmatos' recent follow-up to Beyond the Black Rainbow, Mandy. If Beyond the Black Rainbow was an 80s sci-fi fan's psychedelic nightmare, then Mandy is an 80s horror and heavy metal fan's psychedelic dream. The film draws from imagery and story elements of 80s horror films like Near Dark, Nomads, The Wraith, and again Hellraiser, with action revenge films like Conan the Barbarian and The Road Warrior thrown in for good measure, but takes all these genres in a very dreamy, entrancing direction. It also manages to find the perfect setting for Nick Cage to go full Nick Cage. Mandy is an homage to 80s genre films, but also it's simply a piece of film art, and one of my favorite films of the year. But I'm a weird guy, so take that for what it's worth.
It's crazy evil!
It is now around a decade since the 80s retrowave trend really started to gain momentum. So, I pose the question, after Mandy, do you believe 80s retrowave cinema has anywhere further to go? Or has it run its course? Are films like Jonah Hill's Mid-90s a prelude to a movement of 90s retrowave cinema? And what exactly might future films in such a genre look like? As I pointed out earlier, the quarter-century cycle is not exact science, so I believe we will continue to see more great examples of films inspired by the stories and style of the 1980s. And perhaps if this trend does go out of fashion, it will return again in another cycle. If I didn't include your favorite example of 80s retrowave cinema in this video, it could be that I didn't think it fully committed to the story style and aesthetics of the 1980s. But I would be very interested to hear what your favorites are, or films I might have overlooked. Also, please let me know your favorite examples of music, video games, and books that fall into this category, as I didn't really cover those. Please like and subscribe for more videos that appeal to old curmudgeons trying to relive their idealized childhood as a way of escaping their current reality.
Awesome!
And if you enjoyed this video and want me to post more than one every couple months, please donate to my channel Patreon, listed in the description below. Thanks, and until next time.